Today we will go over graphs of sine and cosine, also transformations of those graphs. So let's start by thinking of what the graph would look like, the graph of the parent function. So let's look at x, y equals sine x. And let's just evaluate these without a calculator. If we have a graph and we've rotated 0, we'll be right there. And we need the y value, y over r. The y value of this is 0, and the radius is 1. Sine is 0. Here we would have a 30, 60, 90, and that's going to be a 1, 2, radical 3. We want the y value is 1, and the radius is 2. Pi over 4, 1, 2, radical 1, 1, radical 2. So this is going to be y over r. Pi over 3, 1, 2, radical 3. We want the y over r. Here the y value is 1, and the r is 1, 1 over 1. Here we have 1, 2, radical 3 with a negative on the x. That doesn't matter here. And we want y over r. Here we want y over r, 1 over radical 2. And let's get decimal values for these because we're going to graph them. 0.71, 0.71, radical 3 over 2 is 0.86, approximately 0.86. And let's see what the graph looks like. We've gone to 3 pi over 4. This will be pi over 4. This is approximately pi over 6 and pi over 3. They're not evenly spaced. If they were, then that would be a pi over 8. So that's a pi over 6. And there's pi over 4. These are these angles. Pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, pi over 2, 3 pi over 4. This will be 2 pi over 3, 5 pi over 6. And we have 0, 0. Pi over 6, 1 half. Pi over 6, 1 half. Pi over 4, 0.7. Pi over 4 to 0.7. Pi over 3, 0.86. Pi over 3, 0.86. Pi over 2 goes to 1. Then we'll go to 2 pi over 3 is 0.86. 2 pi over 3, 0.86. 3 pi over 4 to 0.7. Alright, if we keep going with the table, we're going to find, let's look at what pi is. Pi is there, its y value is 0, so the y value is 0. And at 3 pi over 2, we're going to be at -1, and then back up there. this continues with the same pattern. Um, the length from here to here is called the period, and the period of the parent function is 2 pi. This distance is called the amplitude, the actual graph is called a cycle. This part of the graph we can also talk about frequency, and that is 1 over the period. In this case, 1 over 2 pi. Okay, and just so that we don't have to do all of this work every time, we're going to memorize these points. We have 5 points to memorize, and so that's going to be 0, 0, pi over 2, 1, pi, 0, 3 pi over 2, negative 1, and 2 pi, 0. Alright, let's do the same thing with cosine. And you can use the same pictures that we used in the previous problem. We have all the same pictures. So pause the video, find the values of cosine, and see what the graph looks like. X is 1, R is 1, cosine is 1. X is radical 3, R is 2. X is 1, R is radical 2. X is 1, R is 2. X is 0, R is 1. And X is negative 1, R is 2. X is negative 1, R is radical 2. Negative radical 3 over 2. About 0.86. 1 over radical 2, 0.71. Negative 0.71. Oops. Negative 0.71. And negative 0.86. Let's see what the graph looks like. Pi over 4, pi over 6, pi over 3. At 0, we start at 1. Pi over 6, we go to 0.86. Pi over 6, 0.86. Pi over 4, 0.7. Pi over 3, 1/2, and then at pi over 2, 0. At 2 pi over 3, negative 1/2. 3 pi over 4, negative 0.7. And then if we'll go back up there. And let's memorize these. The points we need to memorize are 0, 1, pi over 2, 0, pi negative 1, 3 pi over 2, 0, 2 pi 1. And then a little review of transformations. So f of x is the parent function, and a is outside of x. A is an outside change. Here a is an inside change. So when we have a on the outside, it's not changing the x, therefore it's changing the y, and we're going to multiply. We have both of them are dilations. That's a vertical dilation. And we multiply y values by a. This is a horizontal dilation. We divide x values by a. If it's negative, we still do the same thing, but that makes a reflection, horizontal reflection. Here a negative, here would make a vertical reflection. Alright, so it's outside, it's not inside with the x. If it's outside, then it's vertical, and we don't use the inverse. So this is, we're going to multiply y values by 3. If every y value gets bigger, then that's going to be a vertical stretch. Here we have a change inside change. We're going to do the inverse of this. This says multiply, so we're going to divide by a half, and that means we will have a horizontal dilation, but let's see what it's going to be, a compression or a stretch. We have to divide x values by 1/2. When we divide by a half, that means the x values get larger. That means it's going to be a horizontal stretch, because all the x values stretch out wider. Alright, pause the video and try that one, and also try this one. 2 is inside, so that's horizontal, and we do the inverse of 2 times x. So we have to divide x values by 2. If all the x values get divided by 2, they get smaller, so that'll be the horizontal compression. Down here, 1/3 is outside, so we're going to not do the inverse. We do multiply y values by 1/3. Multiply y values by 1/3, and that, if all the y values get smaller, then that's a vertical compression. All right, and now we have the memorized points for cosine, and then we're going to do this to it. We already know that that's an outside change. We're going to multiply the y values by -1/3, so we can describe what it is. The negative is a vertical reflection, and we're going to multiply the y values by 1/3 to make them smaller, so that will be a vertical compression. And let's look at the points that we memorized for cosine. Cosine starts high and then it goes low, so that's 0, 1. Then we'll go to pi over 2, 0. Then we go to pi, -1, 3 pi over 2, 0, and 2 pi back up to 1. Then we can just change the x or the y based on whatever the transformation is. So if we have -1/3 cosine, we know that's an outside change. We're going to not do the inverse. We are going to multiply all the y values by -1/3. So I don't change the x values. We do multiply the y values by -1/3. -1/3, +1/3, times -1/3, times -1/3. So now we have the points for cosine and for the transformation g. Alright, let's graph cosine. And cosine is at 0, 1. Let's also look at the other side. And then we'll just plot the other points. 0, negative 1/3, 0, negative 1/3, pi over 2, 0, pi, up 1/3, down to 0, and then down to negative 1/3. And on the other side, we're going to go here, 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 and we see F and G. Alright, same question. F of x is sine, G of x is negative 8 sine. Pause and try that one. So we know it's going to be a vertical reflection, and we're going to multiply the y values by 8, so that will be a vertical stretch. Let's look at the parent function, 0, 0, pi over 2, so we have to have those memorized, and then we will multiply y values by negative 8. And so we have the parent function 0, 0, pi over 2, pi, and the transformation 0, 0, pi over 2, negative 8, back up to 0, then we're going to go to positive 8, back down. And we're going to go up to 8, down to 0, down to negative 8. And we have g of x and f of x. Same question, and pause, try that one. So 2 is inside, that's horizontal, and we're going to do the inverse. So we have to divide x values by 2. If every x value gets divided by 2 gets smaller, then that's going to be a horizontal compression. And we'll just use the parent function values for cosine, which starts high and goes low. So that's going to be 0, 1, pi over 2, pi. At pi we're at negative 1, then we go back up to 0, and up to 1, with cosine 2x, we will divide all the x values by 2. Now we divide the x value. And when we graph the parent function, this is all we need, but we're going to have to add more when we do the transformation. So we'll have 0, 1, pi over 4, no, 0, 1, pi over 2, 0, pi over 2, 0, pi, negative 1, 2 pi, 1. And this is cosine, it's f of x. And then we'll look at 0, 1, pi over 4, 0. So 0, 1, now we have to go to pi over 4, 0, pi over 2, negative 1, and 3 pi over 4, 0, and then pi, 1, pi, 1. And that is the compression. We can see it being compressed, g of x. Last one. Alright, pause and try that. We have 1/4 on the inside, so that's a horizontal change. We'll do the inverse of what this is. That means we have to divide by 1/4. Divide x values by 1/4. If we divide by 1/4, the x values get larger, and that will be a horizontal stretch. And let's use the points for the parent function 0, 0. And then we'll go to pi over 2, 1, pi 0, 3 pi over 2, negative 1, 2 pi 0. We know we have to divide the x values by 1/4. That means we can multiply by 4. Multiply the x value by 4. That'll be 4 pi over 2. 4 pi. 6 pi. We can see that we're going up 2 pi, 2 pi, 2 pi, so that's going to be 8 pi. We know we have to draw it all the way out to 8 pi. Amplitude is still 1. So the parent function is in here. That's pi, pi over 2, 3 pi over 2. And we'll start at 0. Parent function pi over 2 goes to 1. There's pi over 2, 1. Pi is 0. 3 pi over 2 negative 1. Parent function. The horizontal stretch, we're going to go 0, 0, 2 pi to 1, 4 pi 0, 6 pi negative 1, and that will be g of x and f of x. And we'll stop there.